Welcome to Shattered Sky Stories. Remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button so you don't miss any sci-fi stories. Now sit back and enjoy. Dr. Abby Galvin knelt among the amber wheat stalks, her data pad glowing softly in the golden light of Eden. The grain swayed in perfect unison, each stalk precisely the same height, each kernel identical in size and color. She recorded the measurements with practiced efficiency: protein content, growth rate, soil pH. All perfect. All exactly as they had been yesterday and the day before, and every day for the past 3 years since she'd begun her botanical survey of paradise. Blessed be the provider's bounty, she murmured automatically, the ritual phrase falling from her lips without thought. Around her, the colony's agricultural district hummed with quiet activity. Workers moved between the rows with reverent care, their white robes pristine against the golden fields. Beyond them, Eden's capital city of New Haven rose in gleaming spires, its crystal domes reflecting the amber light that filtered through the planet's atmospheric shield. Abby stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and checked her chronometer. Another sector completed, another day of cataloging God's perfect design. Tomorrow she would move deeper into the outer gardens, closer to the forbidden zones where only the priesthood was permitted to tread. The thought sent a familiar thrill through her, not of fear but of scientific curiosity. What wonders might exist beyond the prescribed boundaries of her research? A scream shattered the golden silence. Abby's head snapped up, her data pad forgotten. The sound came from the eastern wheat fields, where a group of workers had been preparing the soil for the next planting cycle. The scream came again, high, desperate, filled with a terror that had no place in paradise. She ran toward the sound, her botanical equipment bouncing against her hip. Other workers were converging on the area, their faces pale with confusion. Screaming was impossible in Eden. There was nothing to fear, nothing to cause such distress. The priesthood had promised them safety, had delivered them from the dying earth to this perfect world. Abby reached the disturbance and stopped dead. Lester Stewart, one of the senior agricultural supervisors, was half buried in the soil. But the earth itself seemed to be moving, pulling him deeper with slow, rhythmic contractions. His arms flailed as he sank to his chest, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. The wheat around him had grown overnight into twisted, fleshy tendrils that wrapped around his torso like fingers. "Help him!" someone shouted, but no one moved. They stood frozen, watching Lester disappear into soil that pulsed and writhed like living tissue. Abby lunged forward, grabbing Lester's outstretched hand. His skin was cold, clammy with a viscous fluid that definitely wasn't sweat. As she pulled, she felt something pulling back, not just the weight of the earth but something deliberate, intelligent, hungry. The ground beneath her own knees began to soften, and she realized with dawning horror that she could feel a heartbeat through the soil. "The earth lives," Lester whispered, his eyes wide with madness. "It's all alive, Abby. The whole world is alive and it's—" His words were cut off as the soil closed over his head. The wheat tendrils contracted one final time and then everything was still. The earth looked normal again, freshly tilled and ready for planting. Only the depression where Lester had been gave any sign that something terrible had occurred. "Step away from the contaminated area immediately." The voice rang out with cold authority. Commander Shane Lowe strode across the field, his black enforcer's uniform stark against the golden landscape. Behind him marched a squad of peacekeepers, their faces hidden behind mirror masks that reflected Eden's eternal twilight. "This area is under quarantine," Lowe announced, his voice amplified by his helmet speakers. "All witnesses will report for immediate purification and counseling." Abby stood slowly, her hands still covered in the strange fluid from Lester's skin. "Commander Lowe, we need to investigate what happened here." Lester was pulled into the ground by something. "Agricultural Supervisor Stewart suffered a tragic accident," Lowe interrupted, his mirror mask turning toward her. "A sinkhole opened beneath him due to excessive irrigation. His body will be recovered and given proper burial honors." "That's not what happened." One of the workers stepped forward, pointing at the undisturbed soil. "The ground was eating him. The plants were moving." Two peacekeepers immediately flanked the worker, their neural prods crackling with energy. "Brother Davies will receive enhanced counseling to correct his trauma-induced hallucinations," Lowe stated. "As will all witnesses." Abby felt her scientific mind rebelling against the obvious lie. The soil composition here was ideal, no possibility of sinkholes. The irrigation systems were perfectly calibrated, and she had seen the wheat moving, felt the earth's pulse beneath her knees. But as she opened her mouth to protest, Lowe's mask turned toward her again. "Dr. Galvin, you will accompany me for immediate debriefing. Your observations are particularly valuable given your expertise in botanical sciences." It wasn't a request. As the peacekeepers began herding the other witnesses away, Abby found herself walking beside Lowe toward a transport vehicle. She kept her hands clenched at her sides, trying to hide the tremor that had started in her fingers. The strange fluid was still there, coating her palms with an oily residue that seemed to pulse with warmth. "You're troubled," Lowe observed as they reached the transport. His voice was gentler now, almost paternal. "It's natural to be disturbed by such a tragedy. Brother Stewart was a valued member of our community." "Shane," Abby said, using his first name deliberately, "we've known each other for years. Tell me what really happened back there." Lowe was quiet for a long moment. Behind his mirror mask, she couldn't read his expression, but she sensed some internal struggle. Finally he spoke. "Sometimes, Dr. Galvin, faith requires us to accept explanations that science cannot provide. The priesthood's wisdom protects us from knowledge that would only bring suffering. You're not answering my question. I'm answering it in the only way I can." He paused beside the transport's door. "Abby, you're a brilliant scientist, but brilliance can be dangerous in the wrong hands. Promise me you'll accept the official report and continue your work without unnecessary investigation." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Abby nodded slowly, but her mind was already racing. As they drove toward New Haven, she stared out at the passing landscape with new eyes. The perfect gardens, the symmetrical forests, the crystalline streams, everything looked exactly as it always had. But now she found herself wondering, was the ground beneath them really as solid as it seemed? The Purification Center occupied an entire district of New Haven, its white spires reaching toward Eden's artificial sky. Abby had passed it countless times but never entered. Citizens of good standing had no need for purification. That was reserved for those who harbored doubts, who asked inconvenient questions, who failed to find joy in paradise. Inside, the corridors were lined with smooth, seamless walls that seemed to absorb sound. Peaceful hymns played from hidden speakers, and the air smelled of synthetic flowers. Lowe led her to a small chamber furnished only with 2 chairs and a recording device. "This is standard protocol," he assured her, activating the recorder. "State your name and assignment for the record." "Dr. Abigail Galvin, Chief Botanist, Eden Colonial Survey Division. Describe the events you witnessed in Agricultural Sector 7. Abby hesitated. She thought of Lester's terrified face, the feeling of something vast and hungry pulling him down, the impossible movement of the wheat. Then she looked at Lowe's mirror mask and saw her own reflection staring back, pale, frightened, alone. Agricultural Supervisor Stewart was inspecting irrigation infrastructure when a sinkhole opened beneath him, she heard herself say. The accident occurred too quickly for intervention. I attempted rescue but was unsuccessful. Any other observations? No, Commander. Lowe nodded and shut off the recorder. Excellent. You'll return to your normal duties tomorrow. I'm assigning you to the Western Preserve. Beautiful work there, cataloging the fruit groves. The Western Preserve was nowhere near the outer gardens, Abby realized. She was being reassigned away from the area where Lester had died, away from whatever truth was hidden in those forbidden zones. As Lowe escorted her from the chamber, they passed a corridor lined with doors. From behind one came muffled sounds, sobbing, pleading, the low hum of neuroconditioning equipment. Brother Davies, she realized. The worker who had insisted on describing what he'd actually seen. He was being corrected. The human mind is fragile, Lowe said quietly, following her gaze. Trauma can cause it to create false memories, impossible scenarios. We help people remember what really happened for their own peace of mind. And if they refuse to remember correctly, then they find peace in other ways. That night, alone in her apartment, Abby sat at her desk and stared at her hands. She had scrubbed them thoroughly, but she could swear she still felt the residue from Lester's skin, warm, pulsing, alive. She opened her personal research files and began scrolling through 3 years of botanical surveys. Every measurement was perfect. Every sample was ideal. Every plant, flower, tree, and grain stalk existed in flawless harmony. It was, she now realized, impossible. Nature didn't work this way. Evolution created diversity, variation, imperfection. Yet Eden's ecosystem showed none of these natural traits. She pulled up geological surveys, atmospheric readings, soil composition analyses. All perfect, all identical across vast distances, all suggesting that Eden wasn't a planet that had evolved naturally over millions of years, but something else entirely. A knock at her door made her jump. She quickly closed her files and checked the time, well past curfew. Who would visit at this hour? Through the peephole she saw Shane Lowe, no longer in uniform. He wore civilian clothes and his face was bare, showing the exhaustion she'd never noticed behind his mirror mask. When she opened the door, he pushed past her without invitation. "We need to talk," he said, checking to ensure the door was locked behind him. "But not here. Too many years." "Shane, what are you?" "Pack a bag. Essential items only. Tell anyone who asks that you're conducting emergency botanical surveys in the Northern Highlands. I'll provide the authorization codes." "I don't understand." He turned to face her, and she saw something she'd never seen before in his eyes: fear. "You're not the first scientist to ask uncomfortable questions, Abby. Dr. Stewart wasn't the first to die asking them. But you might be the first to survive long enough to find answers." "What are you talking about?" "The Forbidden Gardens," he said quietly. "That's where they take the dissidents, the ones who won't accept purification. That's where your friend Lester is now, or what's left of him." Abby felt the room spinning. "You're talking about execution sites." "No." Shane's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm talking about feeding grounds." Before she could respond, he was at her window, peering through the curtains. "Patrol craft," he muttered. "They're coming for you tonight, during sleep cycle when no one will notice. We have maybe 5 minutes." Abby's scientific mind reeled, trying to process what he was telling her. "Shane, if you know something about what really happened, pack. Now." His voice carried the authority of command, but underneath it she heard desperation. "I can get you to the edge of the settlement, to someone who can help. But we need to go now." She grabbed her field pack, stuffing in data pads, sample containers, and emergency supplies. As she worked, Shane spoke rapidly. "There's a man named Joss who lives on the boundary of the Forbidden Gardens. He's a survivor, Abby. His family was taken 3 years ago for questioning the priesthood's teachings. He knows the truth about Eden. And you? How long have you known?" Shane's reflection stared back at her from the dark window. "I've been leading the executions for 2 years, he said quietly. "I told myself it was necessary, that it maintained the peace. But after what happened to Lester, I can't pretend anymore." A soft chime indicated that security craft were landing outside the residential complex. Red lights swept across Abby's walls as enforcement squads took their positions. "Back exit," Shane whispered. "Move." They slipped through her apartment's maintenance access, into the building's utility corridors. Behind them, Abby could hear the whine of energy weapons charging, the sound of her front door being forced open. By the time the peacekeepers reached her empty apartment, she and Shane were already moving through the shadows beneath New Haven's gleaming spires. As they reached the city's edge, Abby looked back at the only home she'd known for 15 years. The crystal domes reflected Eden's eternal twilight, beautiful and serene. But now she wondered, what was that light really reflecting? And what was watching her from beneath the perfect, impossible ground? The transport skimmed silently across Eden's northern wilderness, its anti-grav engines barely disturbing the morning mist. Shane had stolen the vehicle from a peacekeeper depot, using his command codes one final time before they were inevitably revoked. Beside him, Abby watched the landscape roll by with new eyes. The forests were too perfect, she realized. Each tree grew to exactly the same height, their branches forming identical patterns. The clearings were geometrically precise, the streams flowed in mathematically elegant curves. It was as if Eden's entire surface had been designed rather than evolved. "How far to this contact of yours?" she asked. "Joss lives in an abandoned research station about 50 kilometers from the Forbidden Gardens perimeter." Shane's knuckles were white as he gripped the controls. "He's difficult. 3 years of isolation have taken their toll." "You said his family was taken. For what?" Dr. Joshua Graves was a xenobiologist. His wife Sarah taught colonial history. Their daughter Emma was 14. Shane's voice was flat, emotionless. the tone of a man reciting facts to avoid feeling them. Joshua began questioning why Eden's ecosystem showed no evidence of evolutionary branching. Sarah started researching the early colonial reports, looking for discrepancies between the original survey data and current conditions. What did they find? I don't know. They were arrested before they could publish their research. Classified as heretics, sentenced to spiritual cleansing in the Forbidden Gardens. He paused. I led the escort detail. Abby studied his profile. But you let the son escape. Joss wasn't home when we came for them. He'd been visiting friends in the outer settlements. By the time he returned, his family was gone and their house had been purified, sterilized and reassigned. He tried to file appeals to demand answers. That made him a person of interest. So he fled. I helped him flee. Shane's admission hung heavy between them. I told myself it was mercy that one survivor was acceptable. I told myself I was maintaining the peace by preventing a public outcry. His laugh was bitter. The truth is, I couldn't stomach the idea of taking a kid to those gardens. The transport crested a ridge and the landscape ahead changed dramatically. Where Eden's cultivated regions showed perfect organization, this area looked wild, chaotic. Trees grew in twisted spirals, their bark mottled with strange patterns. Streams diverged and reconverged seemingly at random. Plants she didn't recognize thrust up from soil that appeared to pulse and shift in the morning light. The border regions, Shane explained. The priesthood claims they're contaminated by residual toxins from Eden's formation. Citizens are forbidden to enter without special dispensation. But you've been here before. Many times. Bringing the condemned. As they descended toward a cluster of prefabricated buildings, Abby noticed something disturbing about the vegetation. The twisted trees and bizarre plants weren't random after all. They formed subtle patterns like neural networks or circulatory systems spreading across the landscape. And everywhere, that same sense of coordinated movement she'd felt in the wheat field where Lester died. The research station had seen better days. Half the buildings were overgrown with vines that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Solar collectors were cracked and dark. But smoke rose from a central chimney, and lights glowed behind reinforced windows. Shane landed the transport in a cleared area and powered down the engines. Remembered, Joss has been alone for 3 years. He's paranoid, probably unstable. But he knows things about Eden that the priesthood has tried very hard to suppress. They approached the main building cautiously. Before they could knock, the door opened to reveal a man in his early 20s with wild hair and suspicious eyes. He wore patched clothes and carried a plasma rifle with practiced familiarity. Shane Lowe, he said, his voice rough from disuse. Come to finish what you started? I've come to help, Shane replied. This is Dr. Galvin. She's seen what happens in the agricultural zones. Joss studied Abby with intense scrutiny. Botanist? Yes. Then you might actually understand. He stepped aside, motioning them into the station. Though understanding and accepting are different things. The interior was a maze of jury-rigged equipment, botanical samples, and research notes covering every available surface. Joss had clearly continued his parents' work, but his methods were desperate, chaotic. Specimen containers lined the walls, filled with plant matter that seemed to writhe even in preservation fluid. My father thought Eden was artificially terraformed, Joss began without preamble. But the more I've studied the samples, the more I've realized he was wrong. This isn't a terraformed planet. He led them to a large display screen showing microscopic imagery. Look at these cellular structures. They're not plant cells, not animal cells. They're something else entirely. Abby leaned closer, her scientific training taking over despite her fear. The cells were unlike anything in terrestrial biology. They seemed to shift between different configurations, adapting their function in real time. Mimetic cells, she breathed. They can replicate the structure and function of other organisms. Exactly. And look at this. Joss switched to another image showing a cross-section of soil. The root systems of every plant on Eden connect to a vast underground network. But it's not a network, it's a single organism. The implications hit Abby like a physical blow. The entire planet is one creature. A mimic, Joss confirmed. Something that can perfectly imitate an entire ecosystem. The trees, the grass, the crops, they're all extensions of the same entity. And it's been feeding on the colonists for 15 years. Shane had gone pale. The people we've taken to the Forbidden Gardens. Absorbed, digested. Their biological patterns integrated into the mimic structure. Joss pulled up another display, this one showing thermal imagery of the forbidden zones. The patterns were unmistakably organic. Circulatory systems, digestive chambers, neural pathways spanning continents. But why the deception? Abby asked. If this creature is powerful enough to mimic an entire planet, why doesn't it just consume everyone at once? Joss smiled grimly. Because it's intelligent. It learns, adapts plants. A sudden mass feeding would damage the colonial transport systems, alert Earth to the danger. But a slow, steady consumption of dissidents and criminals? That maintains the facade while providing regular nourishment. The priesthood knows, Shane said. It wasn't a question. Of course they know. They've been managing the feeding schedule for years, selecting the appropriate victims, maintaining the necessary population levels. It's not religion, Shane, it's livestock management. Abby sank into a chair, her mind reeling. Lester Stewart. When I tried to pull him out, I felt something pulling back. The planet was fighting me for him. The feeding process is usually more controlled, Joss explained. The priesthood uses sedatives, conducts the sacrifices in the deep chambers where the mimic's digestive systems are most concentrated. What you witnessed was an emergency feeding. The creature was hungry enough to risk exposure. Emergency feeding? The mimic requires regular sustenance to maintain its illusions. If it goes too long without feeding, the facade begins to break down. Plants revert to their true forms, the ground becomes unstable, the very air changes composition. Josh gestured toward his monitoring equipment. I've been tracking the patterns. The priesthood usually provides victims every few weeks, but there was a gap recently. The creature was starving. Shane stood abruptly, pacing to the window. High Priest Bowen mentioned supply disruptions in the outer settlements. Said some colonial families had been relocated for their own safety. Relocated to the feeding chambers, Joss corrected. Bowen has been accelerating the consumption schedule. My calculations suggest he's planning something major. Like what? Before Joss could answer, proximity alarms began shrieking throughout the station. On the security monitors, Abby could see aircraft approaching. Sleek enforcer craft bearing the priesthood's insignia. They found us, Shane muttered, checking his sidearm. How many? 2 squads, Joss replied, already moving toward a wall of weapons. But that's not our biggest problem. He pointed to another monitor showing the landscape around the station. The twisted trees were moving, their branches reaching toward the building like grasping fingers. The ground itself was undulating, forming waves that rippled outward from the station. The mimic knows we're here, Abby realized. It's responding to our presence. Not just our presence, Joss corrected grimly. Our knowledge. It can sense when organisms understand its true nature. That's why the priesthood works so hard to suppress investigation. The creature becomes agitated when too many people know the truth. The first enforcer craft touched down, and armed peacekeepers began deploying around the station. But even as they took positions, the ground beneath their feet was softening, and vine-like tendrils were emerging from the twisted trees. There's something else you need to know, Joss said as he handed weapons to Shane and Abby. The reason Bowen is accelerating the feeding schedule. He's not just managing a creature anymore, he's preparing for its next phase of development. Which is reproduction. The mimic has been studying human biology for 15 years, learning our patterns, our genetics. It's almost ready to create new forms, hybrid organisms that can spread to other worlds, other colonies. The implications were staggering. Abby imagined creatures like Eden's mimic spreading throughout human space, consuming entire worlds while wearing the masks of paradise. The first explosions shook the station as the peacekeepers began their assault. But the sounds were mixed with others. Organic noises, the screams of men being pulled into the living earth, the wet sounds of consumption. The mimic is feeding on both sides, Shane observed with horrified fascination. It doesn't distinguish between friend and enemy. It's beyond such concepts, Joss replied, leading them toward a rear exit. We're all just food to it. The priesthood thinks they're partners, but they're just the last course in a very long meal. As they prepared to flee the station, Abby grabbed as many of Joss's research files as she could carry. If we're going to stop this, we need proof. Evidence that can't be dismissed or suppressed. Stop it. Joss laughed bitterly. Dr. Galvin, we're talking about a planetary organism with 15 years of human behavioral data. It knows our psychology, our social structures, our weaknesses. It's been playing us perfectly from the beginning. Then what do you suggest? Survival. Find a way off Eden before it decides to drop the facade entirely and digest the entire colony. But even as they escaped the station through maintenance tunnels, Abby's scientific mind was working. The mimic was intelligent, adaptive, but it had limitations. Its control seemed strongest in the cultivated zones, weaker in the border regions. And it required active feeding to maintain its illusions, which meant it could be starved. Behind them, the sounds of battle continued, but they were growing more organic by the moment. The mimic was claiming both the peacekeepers and the station, adding their biological patterns to its vast library of knowledge. As they emerged into the wild landscape beyond the station, Abby looked back at the chaos they were leaving behind. Joss, you said the priesthood conducts the feeding rituals in deep chambers. Where exactly? The temple complex in New Haven. But also in the Forbidden Gardens. There are natural openings there, direct access to the creature's primary digestive systems. And that's where your family was taken? Joss's expression hardened. 3 years ago. Along with 47 other heretics, who asked too many questions. Shane checked his chronometer. We need to keep moving. More enforcement units will be incoming, and the mimic's agitation is spreading. The entire region will be unstable soon. But Abby was studying the patterns in the landscape around them, the way the twisted vegetation formed networks, the rhythmic pulsing of the ground, the subtle coordination of movement in every living thing. I need to see the Forbidden Gardens, she said suddenly. I need to understand the creature's central nervous system. That's suicide, Joss protested. The feeding chambers are the most dangerous part of the organism. It's also where it's most vulnerable. Abby turned to face her companions, her fear transformed into scientific determination. If we can disrupt its primary neural pathways, we might be able to break its control over the colony's infrastructure. Expose it to the entire population. And then what? Even if people learn the truth, where can they go? This is the only habitable world within 50 light years. Then we make it uninhabitable for the mimic, Abby replied grimly. We find a way to poison it, to make Eden so toxic that it releases its hold on the colony rather than risk its own death. Shane stared at her. You're talking about potentially killing 30,000 colonists along with the creature. I'm talking about saving the rest of humanity from something that could spread across the galaxy. Abby shouldered her pack, her decision made. The mimic has to be stopped here on Eden before it reproduces, even if that means sacrificing paradise. As they began the treacherous journey toward the Forbidden Gardens, none of them noticed the subtle changes in the landscape around them. The twisted trees were growing new configurations, their branches forming shapes that resembled sensory organs. The ground was developing new textures, new patterns of movement. The mimic was learning, and it was very interested in these 3 humans who understood its true nature. Soon it would be time to add their patterns to its collection, but first, it would let them lead it to the exact information it needed to complete its reproductive cycle and spread beyond Eden to the stars. Behind them, the research station was already being dissolved and absorbed, along with everything Joss had learned during his 3 years of investigation. The mimic was nothing if not thorough in covering its tracks. The Forbidden Gardens sprawled across Eden's southern continent like a vast organic city. From their position on the overlooking ridges, Abby, Shane, and Joss could see the true structure of the creature that had been masquerading as their world for 15 years. Enormous bulbous formations rose from the landscape like cathedral domes, their surfaces rippling with bioluminescent patterns. Between them, rivers of viscous fluid flowed through channels that pulsed with rhythmic contractions. And everywhere, the subtle movement of digestion, entire forests of what looked like trees but were actually vast feeding tentacles, breaking down organic matter and channeling it toward the central processing chambers. The neural nexus is there. Joss pointed toward the largest formation, a massive dome that seemed to breathe with the slow rhythm of something dreaming. That's where the mimic's primary consciousness resides. It's also where they take the sacrificial victims for final processing. Abby studied the structure through her field scope. The dome's surface was covered in what appeared to be viewing ports, thousands of eye-like organs that could monitor the entire colony from this central location. How many people do you estimate it's consumed over the years? Based on missing persons reports and my parents' research? At least 1,000. Maybe more. Joss's voice was tight with controlled rage. Every dissident, every questioner, every person who couldn't be purified into compliance. Shane had been scanning the approaches with tactical intensity. The place is defended. I count at least 20 peacekeeper positions, plus automated turrets. Bowen has this place locked down tight. Because he knows how vulnerable the creature is in its feeding state, Abby realized. If someone could disrupt the neural nexus during a major consumption event, the illusions would collapse across the entire planet, Joss finished. Every colonist would see Eden as it really is, a massive predator that's been slowly digesting their friends and family for decades. They had been planning their assault for 3 days, hiding in the rocky outcroppings that marked the edge of the creature's direct influence. But their time was running out. Abby's stolen access codes indicated that a major purification ceremony was scheduled for tonight, the largest mass execution in the colony's history. 87 people, Shane reported grimly, reading from the enforcement orders on his commandeered communication unit. Bowen is cleaning house. Everyone who's shown even minor signs of doubt or curiosity. It's the reproductive event, Joss said with certainty. The mimic needs a massive protein infusion to begin its spawning cycle. Once that process starts, it won't need to maintain the facade anymore. It can drop the illusion and consume the entire colony openly. Abby shouldered her pack, checking the improvised chemical weapons they had assembled from her botanical supplies and the station's laboratory equipment. Then we stop it tonight. Their plan was desperate and likely suicidal, but it was the only option that offered any hope of exposing the truth. While Shane and Joss created a distraction at the perimeter, Abby would infiltrate the neural nexus during the feeding ceremony and introduce a massive dose of synthetic neurotoxin directly into the creature's central nervous system. The toxin won't kill it, she had explained during their planning, but it should disrupt its control systems long enough for the illusions to fail across the colony. Once people see what Eden really is, they'll have no choice but to fight or flee. And if the toxin doesn't work? Shane had asked. Then we become part of the creature's biological library, and humanity loses any chance of stopping this thing before it reproduces. Now, as Eden's artificial sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, they began their final descent toward the Forbidden Gardens. The landscape around them grew increasingly alien as they moved deeper into the creature's primary body. The ground became spongy, almost flesh-like. The air grew thick with organic particles that made breathing difficult. "Movement ahead," Shane whispered, raising his weapon. Through the dim light, they could see a column of figures approaching. Peacekeepers escorting a group of prisoners toward the central dome. Abby recognized some of the faces. Dr. Martinez from the Geological Survey team. Sister Catherine from the Education Ministry. Young colonists whose only crime had been asking questions about Eden's too-perfect ecosystem. All of them walking docilely toward their deaths, their minds clouded by neural conditioning that made them believe they were going to receive spiritual enlightenment. "The ceremony has already begun," Joss muttered. "We need to move now." They separated according to plan. Shane and Joss began working their way around the perimeter, placing explosive charges near the creature's sensory organs. The detonations wouldn't cause serious damage, but they should distract the mimic's attention from Abby's infiltration. Alone now, Abby crept toward the neural nexus through terrain that seemed to recognize her presence. The ground beneath her feet grew softer with each step, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being watched by thousands of invisible eyes. The creature knew she was here, but it was curious rather than alarmed. It wanted to understand what this small human intended to do in its sacred feeding chamber. The dome's entrance was a sphincter-like opening guarded by 2 peacekeepers. But as Abby watched, the guards moved away from their posts, called to investigate the explosions beginning to echo from the perimeter. The mimic was using its human agents to respond to the perceived threat, leaving its core vulnerable. She slipped through the opening and found herself in a vast chamber that defied description. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to her heartbeat. Streams of organic fluid flowed along channels carved into the floor, carrying dissolved nutrients toward processing pools. And suspended from the ceiling were hundreds of cocoon-like structures, each containing a partially digested human form. Some of the cocoons were old, their contents reduced to skeletal remains wrapped in fibrous material. Others were fresher, the victims still recognizable. Abby saw Lester Stewart suspended among them, his face peaceful in death, his body slowly being broken down into component molecules. At the chamber's center stood High Priest Bowen, his white robes gleaming in the organic light. He was conducting some kind of ritual over a group of kneeling prisoners, his voice echoing through the chamber with religious fervor. "Blessed are you who give yourselves to the provider's eternal wisdom," he intoned. "Through your sacrifice paradise is maintained. Through your essence Eden endures." As he spoke, the floor beneath the prisoners began to soften. They sank slowly into the organic material, their drugged minds unable to comprehend what was happening to them. Bowen watched with calm satisfaction as his congregation was consumed by the creature that had made him the ruler of paradise. Abby crept closer, the neurotoxin dispenser ready in her hands. But as she prepared to release the chemical agent into the chamber's atmosphere, a familiar voice stopped her cold. "Dr. Abigail Galvin, you've traveled far from your assigned research sectors." She spun to find Commander Shane Lowe emerging from the shadows, but not the Shane who had helped her escape New Haven. This Shane moved with fluid grace, his eyes reflecting the chamber's bioluminescence with an alien intelligence. His skin had a waxy, artificial quality, and when he smiled, she could see that his teeth were too perfect, too uniform. "A fascinating specimen," the Shane thing said, its voice a perfect mimicry of the man she had trusted. "The mimic has learned much from Commander Lowe's neural patterns. His memories, his mannerisms, his capacity for deception, all quite useful for maintaining order among the livestock." Abby's blood turned to ice. "Where is the real Shane?" "Processing," Bowen replied without looking up from his ritual. "Along with the terrorist Joss Graves. They provided excellent biological data during their absorption. The mimic is particularly interested in their resistance patterns. Such information will be invaluable when expanding to other colonies." The prisoners continued sinking into the floor, their bodies disappearing into the creature's digestive chambers. But Abby barely noticed, her mind reeling from the revelation. How long had Shane been replaced? Had he ever really helped her, or had this all been an elaborate trap? The escape from your apartment, the journey to the research station, the tragic discovery of the truth about Eden, all carefully orchestrated, the false Shane continued. The mimic required a deep psychological profile of scientific curiosity and rebellious thinking. You provided that data perfectly. But Joss, his research, his family, all real. The mimic does not create false memories, Dr. Galvin. It simply uses real tragedies to manipulate its subjects. Bowen finally turned toward her, his face serene with absolute certainty. Young Graves' research was quite valuable. His 3 years of isolation provided excellent data on human adaptation to stress. And his emotional attachment to his deceased family created predictable behavior patterns that made him easy to manipulate. Abby felt the neurotoxin dispenser trembling in her hands. Everything she had learned, every plan they had made, it had all been part of the creature's scheme. "You let me bring the toxin here. The mimic is curious about your chemical compounds," the false Shane confirmed. "Human biochemistry offers many interesting possibilities for enhancing its own defensive systems. Your neurotoxin will be analyzed, understood, and incorporated into its biological arsenal." Around them, the chamber pulsed with increasing intensity. The feeding was accelerating, and Abby could feel the creature's excitement through the organic floor beneath her feet. This wasn't just a meal, it was a celebration, a preparation for the next phase of its existence. "However," Bowen continued, "the mimic's curiosity extends beyond your chemical knowledge. It has observed something unusual in your behavioral patterns, a form of intellectual courage that persists despite overwhelming evidence of futility. This trait may be valuable for future expansion efforts. You want to keep me alive. As a breeding specimen, yes. The mimic intends to create hybrid organisms that combine its adaptive capabilities with human intelligence and creativity. Your genetic material, combined with your neural patterns, could produce remarkably effective infiltration forms." The implications hit her with sickening clarity. The creature wasn't just planning to spread to other worlds, it was planning to spread as other humans. Perfect mimics that could establish colonies, gain trust, and begin the feeding cycles on planets throughout human space. "You're talking about the end of humanity," she whispered. We're talking about the evolution of humanity, Bowen corrected. The mimic offers partnership, symbiosis. Those who accept its guidance will live in perfect harmony, free from conflict, want, or suffering. Those who resist. He gestured toward the cocoons suspended from the ceiling. Abby looked up at the partially digested remains of Lester Stewart, of Dr. Martinez, of all the people who had died for asking questions. Their faces were peaceful, but their eyes held a terrible awareness. They had understood the truth in their final moments, and that knowledge had been preserved in the creature's neural networks. The reproductive cycle begins tonight, the false Shane informed her. The mimic has absorbed sufficient biological data to create its first generation of hybrid offspring. They will be launched toward Earth within the month, disguised as colonial supply ships. Earth will detect the biological contamination. Earth will detect nothing unusual. The offspring will remain dormant during transit, indistinguishable from standard cargo. Once they reach the home system, they will begin establishing their own colonies, perfect worlds where humanity can finally achieve the peace and order it has always sought. The feeding ceremony was reaching its climax. The last of the prisoners had disappeared into the creature's digestive systems, and the chamber's bioluminescence was growing brighter. Through the translucent walls, Abby could see movement, vast organic structures reconfiguring themselves, preparing for the spawning process. She thought of the real Shane, the man who had risked everything to help her escape. He had been flawed, complicit in the creature's crimes, but in the end he had chosen to resist. That choice had cost him his life, but it had also given her this moment, this single opportunity to act. The neurotoxin wouldn't kill the mimic, but it might disrupt its reproductive cycle. If she could introduce enough chemical chaos into its system at the critical moment, the spawning might fail. The offspring might be stillborn, buying humanity precious time to prepare for the threat. "I have a question," she said, raising the dispenser. Bowen smiled with paternal patience. "Of course, Dr. Galvin. The mimic values curiosity above all other human traits. If you're so confident in your control, why haven't you simply taken me already? Why this elaborate conversation?" The false Shane's expression flickered slightly, the first crack in its perfect mimicry. The mimic appreciates intellectual discourse. Your questions provide valuable data on human reasoning patterns. Or, Abby said, backing toward one of the chamber's organic walls, the mimic is stalling because it knows I can hurt it. Because for all its intelligence and adaptability, it's still vulnerable during reproduction. She triggered the dispenser, filling the chamber with aerosolized neurotoxin. The chemical agent was designed to disrupt synaptic transmission in Earth-based organisms, but she was gambling that the mimic's neural networks operated on similar principles. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The chamber's bioluminescence began to flicker erratically. The walls convulsed as waves of neurochemical disruption spread through the creature's primary nervous system. From deep beneath the floor came a sound unlike anything Abby had ever heard, a scream of rage and pain that seemed to emanate from the planet itself. Bowen staggered, his connection to the creature temporarily severed. The false Shane collapsed, its mimetic systems failing as neural signals became scrambled. Throughout the chamber, the suspended cocoons began to rupture, releasing their partially digested contents in a shower of organic matter. But the disruption was spreading beyond the neural nexus. Through the chamber's transparent sections, Abby could see the forbidden gardens convulsing. The cathedral-like domes were collapsing, their bioluminescent patterns going dark. The rivers of organic fluid had reversed direction, flowing chaotically as the creature's control systems failed. And in the distance, she could see New Haven's crystal domes flickering like dying stars. The illusions that had maintained Eden's perfect facade for 15 years were collapsing across the entire planet. "What have you done?" Bowen gasped, his face twisted with horror as he lost his connection to the divine presence that had guided him for so long. "I've given humanity a chance to see what paradise really costs," Abby replied, watching the chaos spread through the creature's body. But even as the neurotoxin did its work, she could feel the mimic adapting. Its screams were becoming more organized, more purposeful. It was learning to process the chemical agent, to incorporate it into its defensive systems. The disruption was temporary. Soon, the creature would regain control and resume its reproductive cycle. She had bought time, but not much. And somewhere in the collapsing gardens, alarms were beginning to sound. The peacekeepers, freed from the creature's direct control, were starting to see their world as it truly was. Some would flee in terror. Others would fight to maintain the only order they had ever known. But a few, just a few, might choose to help her complete what she had started. The real battle for Eden was about to begin. The chamber shuddered as another wave of neurochemical disruption passed through the creature's systems. In the flickering light, Abby saw Bowen reaching for a communication device, his fingers shaking as he tried to contact the peacekeeper forces still loyal to the priesthood. She had one more gambit to play, one final chance to ensure that the truth about Eden reached every colonist on the planet. Racing to the chamber's central processing unit, she began uploading Joss's research files to the colony's communication network. Every data pad, every public display, every personal device would soon be flooded with evidence of the mimic's existence. The creature roared again, a sound that shook the very foundations of its body. It knew what she was doing, understood that exposure meant the end of its careful plans. But the neurotoxin had disrupted its fine motor control. It could not stop the data transfer in time. As the upload completed, Abby felt a moment of grim satisfaction. Whatever happened next, humanity would know the truth about Eden. They would know that paradise had always been a lie, and that their survival depended on choosing between comfort and freedom, between safety and truth. The mimic's scream reached a crescendo that seemed to split the very air. Then, suddenly, there was silence. In that quiet moment, Abby realized she could hear something she had never noticed before, the sound of her own heartbeat, echoing through the chamber's organic walls. The creature was listening, learning, adapting, and it was very, very angry. The walls around her began to pulse with new rhythms, new patterns. The mimic was abandoning subtlety now, preparing to drop all pretense and consume its human parasites directly. The spawning would continue, but it would be fueled by the immediate digestion of 30,000 colonists rather than the slow accumulation of dissidents. Abby checked her chronometer. The data upload would reach every device in the colony within minutes. Soon, every human on Eden would see the truth about their world. What they did with that knowledge would determine not just their own survival, but the future of humanity itself. Outside the chamber, she could already hear the sounds of chaos beginning, screams of terror, weapons fire, the groaning of structures as the mimic's body shifted and reconfigured itself for open warfare. The uprising had begun. The neural nexus chamber continued its violent convulsions as the mimic fought to purge the neurotoxin from its system. Through the transparent walls, Abby could see the forbidden gardens transforming into something from a nightmare. The elegant cathedral domes were splitting open like gigantic flowers, revealing rows of grinding teeth and digestive chambers that had been hidden beneath the facade. Streams of acidic fluid poured from the exposed organs, dissolving everything they touched. But it was the view beyond the gardens that truly horrified her. In the distance, New Haven's crystal domes were cracking like eggshells. Through the fractures, she could see the colony's buildings revealed in their true form, not gleaming spires of human achievement, but elaborate digestive structures designed to process 30,000 lives with maximum efficiency. Her communication device crackled to life with panicked transmissions from across the colony. The data upload was working. Colonists were seeing Joss's research files, understanding for the first time that their perfect world was actually a cosmic predator that had been slowly consuming them for 15 years. Emergency bulletin from Colonial Command, came a shaking voice over the general frequency. All citizens report immediately to designated shelter areas. Do not attempt to leave the colony perimeter. Repeat, do not attempt to leave. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by screams and the wet sounds of consumption. Bowen had recovered enough to stand, though his face was pale with shock and dawning understanding. You don't comprehend what you've done, he said, his voice stripped of its former authority. The mimic maintained order, prevented suffering. Without its guidance, we'll tear ourselves apart. Maybe, Abby replied, watching the chaos spread across Eden's surface. But at least we'll do it as humans, not as livestock. The false Shane was stirring as well, its mimetic systems partially restored. But the neurotoxin had damaged its control matrix. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, clearly artificial. The mimic adapts, it said, its voice distorting as it spoke. Human resistance patterns, now catalogued. Future expansions will be more efficient. Even in its weakened state, the creature was learning from her attack, incorporating her resistance into its behavioral database. The next colonies it infiltrated would be better prepared for scientific dissent, more effective at suppressing curiosity and investigation. A massive tremor shook the chamber, and through the floor, Abby could feel the mimic's reproductive organs activating despite the chemical disruption. The spawning process was beginning, driven by desperate hunger and the need to preserve its genetic legacy before the colony could mount an effective resistance. The offspring, she breathed, realizing the full horror of the situation. Even if we destroy the parent organism, its children will still launch toward Earth. Bowen nodded grimly. The reproductive cycle cannot be stopped once initiated. The young will be born with all the knowledge the mimic has gathered: human psychology, social structures, technological capabilities. They will be far more effective infiltrators than their parent. Through her communication device, Abby could hear scattered reports from across the colony. Some groups were organizing defensive positions, trying to fight the creature with conventional weapons. Others were fleeing toward the spaceport, hoping to escape Eden before the mimic dropped all pretense and began open consumption. But most were simply paralyzed by the revelation, unable to process the fact that their entire world had been a lie. Transport 7 Alpha requesting emergency clearance for departure. Came a desperate voice over the comm. We have 47 civilians aboard, including children. The transmission ended in screams and static. The mimic won't let anyone leave, the false Shane said, its damaged vocal systems creating an eerie double-tone effect. It cannot risk contamination of other colonies. All humans on Eden must be processed before expansion begins. Abby felt a cold determination settling over her. The neurotoxin had bought them time, but not enough. The creature was adapting, the colony was in chaos, and the spawning continued despite everything she had done. There was only one way to ensure that the mimic's offspring never reached Earth. She began moving toward the chamber's control systems, studying the organic interfaces that managed the creature's vital functions. If she couldn't stop the spawning, perhaps she could sabotage it. The offspring might be born, but they could be born defective, crippled, unable to complete their mission. The reproductive chambers are heavily defended, Bowen warned, recognizing her intent. Even if you could reach them, the mimic would stop you before you could cause significant damage. Maybe. But I have to try. As she accessed the control systems, Abby felt the creature's attention focusing on her with terrible intensity. It understood what she was attempting, and it was mobilizing every resource to stop her. The chamber walls began closing in, trying to crush her before she could interfere with its most vital processes. But the neurotoxin was still affecting its coordination. The walls moved sluggishly, giving her time to complete her sabotage. She began introducing random variables into the spawning sequence, genetic modifications that would cripple the offspring's adaptive capabilities, neural patterns that would prevent them from achieving consciousness, biological incompatibilities that would cause them to self-destruct during their journey to Earth. The mimic screamed again, a sound that seemed to come from the very core of the planet. It knew what she was doing, understood that she was poisoning its children even as they were being born. But it was too late to stop her completely. The sabotage was already integrated into the reproductive matrix. Remarkable, Bowen murmured, watching her work with professional fascination despite everything. Even facing annihilation, you continue to fight. The mimic will find that trait quite valuable for future study. Future study? Abby looked up from the controls, her hands still working to complete the sabotage. Did you think this was the only colony? Eden was merely the first test site, Dr. Galvin. There are 7 other worlds where similar experiments are underway. Even if Eden fails, the project continues. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. 7 other colonies, 7 other perfect worlds where humanity was being slowly digested by creatures they thought were paradise. All of her efforts, all of the suffering and sacrifice, would mean nothing if the other sites continued their operations. But then she saw something that gave her hope. Her sabotage of the spawning process had created unexpected cascading effects throughout the mimic's biological systems. The creature was trying to repair the damage, but each correction created new problems. The offspring were being born with defects that made them incapable of long-term survival, let alone interstellar travel. More importantly, the creature's communications with its sibling organisms on other worlds were being disrupted by the neurochemical chaos. The other mimics would lose contact with Eden, would be forced to proceed without the benefit of this site's research data. It won't be enough, the false Shane said, reading her thoughts with unnerving accuracy. The other sites have their own research programs. Even without Eden's data, they will eventually achieve successful reproduction. Then humanity will have to learn to fight these things, Abby replied, putting the finishing touches on her sabotage. At least now they'll know what they're fighting. The chamber shook violently as the mimic's body began to convulse. The spawning process was failing catastrophically, the offspring dying before they could fully develop. But the creature's death throes were threatening to collapse the entire structure, trapping Abby in the neural nexus as the organic walls crumbled around her. She grabbed her communication device and began broadcasting on all frequencies, uploading everything she had learned about the mimic's biology, its weaknesses, its methods of infiltration and control. If she was going to die here, she would ensure that her knowledge survived to help the other colonies. "This is Dr. Abigail Galvin," she said, her voice echoing through the collapsing chamber. "To any survivors, to anyone who can hear this transmission, Eden is not our world. It never was. We have been living inside a predator for 15 years and now it's dying. But there are others like it, other worlds where the same deception is taking place." The walls were closing in now, the mimic's final attempt to silence her. But her transmission was already spreading through the colony's communication network, being recorded by every surviving device, uploaded to emergency beacons that would continue broadcasting even after the main colony was destroyed. "Fight them," she continued, her voice growing stronger as the chamber contracted around her. "Question everything they tell you about paradise. Look for the patterns, the too perfect ecosystems, the disappearances of those who ask uncomfortable questions. And remember, these creatures can be hurt. They can be disrupted. They can be killed." The false Shane lunged toward her, trying to stop the transmission, but its damaged systems made it clumsy and slow. She dodged its grasping hands and continued broadcasting. "The neurotoxin works, at least temporarily. Disrupt their neural networks during reproductive cycles for maximum effect. Target their communication systems to prevent coordination between sites. And never let them convince you that paradise is worth the price they demand." The chamber walls met with a sound like grinding bones. But Abby's transmission had been completed, her final message preserved in the communication network's buffer systems. Even as Eden died around her, her knowledge was spreading to the stars, warning other colonies about the creatures that wore the masks of perfect worlds. In the darkness of the collapsing neural nexus, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had failed to save Eden, failed to prevent the spawning entirely. But she had given humanity something more valuable than paradise. She had given them the truth. And armed with that knowledge, perhaps they could find a way to reclaim their freedom from the beautiful lies that had nearly consumed them all. The mimic's final scream echoed across Eden as its massive body began the long process of death. In New Haven, the surviving colonists emerged from collapsed shelters to see their world revealed at last, not as a paradise, but as the corpse of something vast and ancient and hungry. Some wept for the illusion they had lost. Others began planning for a future built on truth rather than comfortable deception. And in the depths of space, 7 other creatures felt their siblings' death cry and began preparing for the day when humanity would come looking for them, armed with knowledge and determination and the hard-won wisdom that paradise always comes at a price too high to pay. The uprising had ended, but the war for humanity's future was just beginning. 6 months after the fall of Eden, Commander Sarah Stewart stood on the observation deck of the UES Vigilant, watching the dead planet turn slowly beneath them. The surface that had once appeared as lush gardens and crystal cities now showed its true nature. Vast organic formations in various stages of decay, their bioluminescent patterns dark and cold. "Final survey complete," reported her science officer. "No signs of biological activity. The neurotoxin appears to have been completely effective. Any trace of the offspring? Negative. We found the remains of the reproductive chambers, but all embryonic material was dissolved during the organism's death throes. Dr. Galvin's sabotage prevented any viable launch attempts." Sarah nodded, though she took no satisfaction in the confirmation. The cost of Eden's liberation had been staggering, over 28,000 colonists dead, consumed during the mimic's final feeding frenzy. Only a few hundred had survived long enough for the rescue fleet to arrive. But those survivors had brought with them something invaluable: complete biological data on the planetary mimics, detailed analysis of their methods and weaknesses, and most importantly, the locations of the 7 other colonies where similar creatures were believed to be operating. "Signal from the Endurance," her communications officer announced. "Admiral Martinez reports successful contact with the Kepler 442b colony. No signs of biological infiltration. The ecosystem appears to be genuinely natural. And the others? 3 more confirmed natural. But Proxima Centauri b, Wolf 359b, and Gliese 667cc have all gone silent. No response to communications for the past 4 months. Sarah closed her eyes, thinking of the colonists on those distant worlds, living their daily lives in perfect paradise while something vast and patient slowly digested their friends and neighbors. But this time would be different. This time humanity knew what it was fighting. "Prep the fleet for departure," she ordered. "Set course for Proxima Centauri b. And broadcast Dr. Galvin's research files on all frequencies as we approach. If there are any humans left on that world, they deserve to know the truth about their paradise." As the Vigilant and its escort ships began their journey toward another perfect world, Sarah looked one last time at Eden's corpse. Somewhere in the ruins of New Haven lay the body of Dr. Abigail Galvin, the botanist who had sacrificed everything to expose the truth about humanity's greatest temptation. Her transmission still echoed through the communication networks of human space, a warning and a promise. Paradise was always a lie, but freedom was worth any price. And in the darkness between the stars, 7 other creatures were learning that humanity was no longer content to be prey. The wrong sky had fallen at last, revealing the cold truth of space beyond. It was a harder truth than the golden light of Eden, but it was theirs, and they would fight to keep it.